Taming the High Cost of College, Episode 8.
You have kids, they grow up, and before you know it, it's time to plan for college.
Where do you start?
How much is it going to cost?
Will you qualify for financial aid?
Should you be looking into scholarships?
When will you be able to retire?
What about student loans?
The list of questions is never ending. The good news is, all the answers are right here. Welcome to the Taming the High Cost of College podcast. Here is your host, certified financial planner, Brad Baldridge.
Hello, and welcome to Taming the High Cost of College. I'm your host, Brad Baldridge, and here on Episode 8, we are going to have a great interview with Linda Katz. She is an expert on learning disabilities and learning differences and how college fits into that mix. So she works professionally as a coach, helping families figure out how to plan and prepare for college, how to apply to college, how to choose colleges, and do all kinds of things when you also are dealing with learning differences of some sort, whether it's somewhere on the autism spectrum, whether it's ADHD, or other reasons that you might need some special educational help in college. There's a ton of great information. If you know anybody that is dealing with some sort of learning differences and kind of wants the starter course on where to start and what to do, the interview that we're about to have here is a great place for lots of people to start and just get some general information, even if they have a freshman or sophomore and they're starting relatively early. But before we jump into that interview, I'm actually going to do the questions and answers before we get into that interview, and then we're going to go from there. So let's roll into the questions first, and we'll do a couple questions, and then we'll have this great interview with Linda.
Have a question? Brad is accepting questions from his listeners now. Record a question at tamingthehighcostofcollege.com and get it answered on one of the future episodes.
All right, my first question is from John in California, and he wrote just a very basic question, which essentially says, what is the net price calculator? I've heard people talk about it, but I don't understand what it is. So let's talk about the net price calculator. The net price calculator is the name for a calculator that helps you calculate how financial aid is going to work at a particular school. The government has mandated that all colleges that use federal money have to put some sort of net price calculator on their website to help families figure out if they're going to qualify for need-based aid, if they're going to qualify for merit aid. It's a great way for you to kind of get some initial information on what colleges may actually cost. Now, the challenge with the net price calculator is some colleges worked very hard at them and built them very well and made them very accurate. Other colleges, because they were required to put it up, just put something together and put it out there on their website. So first caution I have when it comes to net price calculators is some are better than others, some are more accurate than others. I've been working with students and using the net price calculator, and often we contact the colleges, and colleges give us different answers when we say, well, we worked with your net price calculator. Can you tell me a little bit about what this means? Some colleges essentially say, well, yeah, the net price calculator is not very accurate, especially if you're somehow unusual in the divorce situation. If you're a very high need family, or if you have a high academic student, or whatever it might be, they essentially discount it a lot and say, well, that the calculator's there, but it's not very accurate. Other colleges have told us that they're very, very accurate. So if the calculator says you're eligible for $10,000 of aid, most of the time that's what you're going to get, because they spend a lot of time building the calculator, and the calculator essentially does the same thing that the financial aid office does, and they track very closely. But so now that we know what it is, it's a calculator available on everybody's website. How do we use it, or what is it useful for? And I think there's two places that you can use it. One is at the very preliminary search stages. So if you have a sophomore or junior and you're thinking about some colleges and you're trying to get a feel for early on how college is going to, what it's going to cost, how it's going to work out for you, you can plug some numbers into a couple calculators at a couple of colleges that might be on your list, and you can start seeing, well, am I going to qualify for scholarships? Am I going to qualify for need-based aid and grants and loans? And what's a typical package going to look like? And again, it just helps you get a frame of reference. You know, if I apply to this $50,000 school, will I pay $50,000, or will I get a bunch of aid and only have to pay $20,000? The calculators can help you kind of get an initial reaction from that. The other place I think they're very useful is when you're getting near the end of the process, and maybe you've got your top 1 or 2 or 3 schools. You're right now in the fall, say you have a senior, and you say, well, these 2 schools are really the top of our list, but we're not sure how the prices are going to turn out. Then you can work really hard with the calculator, do a really good job, and put all the information into the best of your ability, and then print out the answers and use that as a talking point when you work with the school. So it gives you the opportunity to talk with somebody in financial aid and say, look, I ran the numbers. Here is how your net price calculator calculated our situation. And here's the inputs that we put in. We think they're accurate. Tell us a little bit more about whether or not this is a realistic projection or not. And some colleges will share more than others, but it gives you the opportunity, I guess, to talk a little bit about the finances and have a frame of reference earlier in the process. Before net price calculators were out there, most families didn't really understand how financial aid was going to work until the end of their senior year, after they've gotten the financial aid offer from the colleges. Of course, at the end of your senior year, you have a couple financial aid offers from the colleges you're interested in. If those offers were too high for your family budget, there wasn't a lot you could do at that time. If you had 3 offers from the 3 schools, they were all really high offers, and you're saying, well, we can't afford these schools. It's late and challenging to say, well, then we need to apply to different schools that might come in at a better price. These 3 private schools aren't going to work. We're going to have to consider a state school or find a private school that's at a lower cost. And I've worked with families that are scrambling like this at the very last minute. So you can use the net price calculator to try and get at some ballpark ideas as to whether or not a college is going to fit within your budget, understand whether or not you're going to qualify for need-based aid. Some of the calculators will also help you figure out if you qualify for merit aid. So I think it's a useful step for most people. It is time consuming, and you do have to understand what you're doing a little bit. And if you need help with it, by all means, give us a call and we can try and help you. But I think it's a step that is absolutely worthwhile. The next question I have comes from a presentation I was doing last week at a high school. And the question essentially is, do I have to apply for financial aid? Do I have to fill out the financial aid forms? And then they went on to say, we're pretty sure we're not going to qualify for any sort of need-based aid. Do we have to go through all the effort of filling out the forms and submitting them, knowing that it isn't going to do any good? And the answer to that is no, you don't have to, but you may still want to. And here's a couple reasons why. First of all, you do need to fill out the FAFSA form in order to be eligible for any of the government loans. So if there's a couple loans that are available, even if you do not qualify for need-based aid, primarily the direct student loan, also formerly known as the Stafford loan. That's a loan to the students, paid back by the student. A freshman can borrow $5,500. To be eligible for that loan, you need to fill out the financial aid forms. The other loan is the PLUS loan. PLUS loan is a loan to the parents, paid back by the parents. And in order to receive that loan, you also have to fill out the FAFSA. Now, the PLUS loan, the maximum you can borrow is cost of attendance minus any other aid. So a lot of families will use either a private loan or a PLUS loan to fill the final gaps of college. So coming up $5,000 or $10,000 short and mom and dad want to borrow that money, a PLUS loan is often a candidate for that. It's not the only way you can do it, but it's certainly in the running. So in order to be eligible for that loan, however, you also need to fill out the FAFSA for there as well. Then I think the final reason you need to fill out financial aid forms is a lot of families are just wrong. They say they're not going to qualify for any sort of need-based aid, but when they actually fill out the forms and get their answer back, they're pleasantly surprised to discover that they do qualify because they don't understand the process well enough, or they did a miscalculation for some reason. And I think some people are surprised and able to get some aid where they thought they wouldn't. Of course, the opposite is also true. There's some families out there where they think they're going to get some aid, and in the end, they don't get as much as they would like. So that's why you would want to fill out the FAFSA. And then on top of that, you also want to fill out the FAFSA for some colleges, because if they're going to give you any of their own money in the form of merit money or other reasons, alumni scholarships, and there's all kinds of different scholarships that they may be providing. But a lot of the colleges will not provide those scholarships until you fill out the financial aid forms. The reason for that is they want to verify that you are, in fact, not eligible for financial aid, not eligible for federal money, before they give you their own. Because what they'd hate to have happen is for them to give you $5,000 or $10,000 or $50,000 of their own money, and then later discover that you were eligible for $5,000 or $10,000 or $50,000 from the federal government. And then, obviously the federal money doesn't cost the college anything. So often colleges, as just a kind of a rule of thumb, they're going to say, well, we want everyone that we offer money to fill out the FAFSA just to verify that they are in fact not eligible for any sort of other aid. All right, so those are the 2 questions. Now we're going to roll into the main interview with Linda Katz. Again, this is a great interview on learning disabilities. If you know anyone that is dealing with learning differences, I would love it if you could forward this on to them. You can share it via Facebook. You can email it to them, whatever you'd like to do. And also, if you are listening to this directly on your computer, just be aware that this is what's called a podcast. So there are ways that you can actually get the podcast sent directly to a device like your phone using an application on your phone. You can also get it sent directly through iTunes, where you'll get every episode as they're released. So if you're technology challenged, ask your student to help you set something up on iTunes, set up a podcasting app on your phone, whatever it might be, so that you can actually get all the episodes, listen to them at your convenience. It's a great way to listen while you're exercising, listen while you're driving, and do those sorts of things. All right, so let's move into the interview with Linda, and we'll go from there. All right, I have an interview today with Linda Katz. She's the founder of Right Fit College Coaching. She's also an educational consultant. She helps families with children with learning disabilities. And welcome, Linda.
Hi, Brad. Thanks for having me.
Not a problem. So tell me a little bit about kind of your background. How did you arrive at being in a position where you help families with learning disabilities in college?
Well, I actually worked for many years as an occupational therapist. I had many different positions, but, I worked with kids starting in early intervention when they were very young, who had sensory difficulties or fine motor difficulties, and then as they got into school age, I worked with kids with learning disabilities. And so I was able to look at it from that perspective. And then later in my career, I also did some peer mediation training work with kids in high schools and realized I really enjoyed working with that age group. And then, my own kids, I have 3 kids myself, my own kids started getting to college age. And as I started looking into all of that with them, realized I was very interested in that stage of life. So it just all kind of came together a number of years back. I went back and did some additional training at UCLA in a college counseling program and finished that and put it all together. And so now I work as an educational consultant, basically with students in high school who have some sort of learning difference or ADHD or type of disability, where they just need a little bit of extra help on figuring out to prepare for college while they're still in high school, and then figure out what's going to be the best fit for them as far as applying to colleges.
Okay, so tell me a little bit about the population out there. You mentioned you work a lot with learning disabilities. Is that a common thing out there, or how many people suffer from learning disabilities, and how many of them are going to college? What do you know about some of the statistics?
Well, I did look that up just so I would be prepared for this call. And a website where folks can learn a lot about learning disabilities in general is www.ncld.org. And that just gives a lot of statistics and helpful information and resources. It's a good one to check out. And they talk about 2.4 million students are diagnosed with learning disabilities and receive special educations in the schools. And those, of course, just are the kids that are diagnosed and are getting services. There are many others that go undiagnosed and are struggling. And they also said that represents about 41% of all the kids receiving special education services are those that have learning disabilities. So it is pretty widespread. And as I said, then there are kids who really don't know that they are struggling so much until they maybe get into their sophomore or junior year in high school, when the workload really starts to increase and that abstract thinking comes into play more often, and kids really start struggling. And, maybe because they've been very bright, they've been able to compensate so far and get by. And then, people start thinking, well, maybe they're just not trying. They just need to put in a little bit more effort. And it turns out that, somebody may say, you know what, maybe this student needs to get tested, which would be psychoeducational testing through school, or if it's done privately, it's often called neuropsychological testing. And oftentimes it comes back that the student is not being lazy, or they're not just not motivated, that they really have something going on, which making it difficult for them to succeed at school.
Right. Okay. So if you're thinking, maybe that you're in this situation, but you've not done anything formally, where do you start as far as getting diagnosed? And what about the stigma? And, what would you do if you had a sophomore where you're thinking maybe we're in that boat?
Also, oftentimes parents will, first they need to talk to their child, because the student definitely needs to be on board and be willing to be tested. But usually they're struggling and frustrated and want to figure out sort of, quote, what's wrong with them, why they are having a harder time than their peers. So, often with some encouragement, they are willing to be tested. State laws can vary, but basically, a parent can request a test, an evaluation from school, and the school needs to, special education folks need to respond to that and provide testing. Sometimes the testing at school, from what I've heard, I don't, work with high schools in this way. But from what I've heard, sometimes the testing at school is not as comprehensive as, parents would like it to be. And in that case, sometimes people do go privately and usually have to pay for it themselves, with sometimes some health insurance covering part of it and other times not at all. To get what's called more neuropsychological testing, it's usually more comprehensive, and the recommendations are usually a little bit more significant. And sometimes families need that in order to be able to tell their school system, yes, there really is a problem and we do need you to provide our, son or daughter services. Sometimes in order to make that happen, families have had to hire an advocate, or sometimes they've just arranged it so the person who did the testing comes to the meeting. And, usually you have to pay the person to do that, the psychologist or whoever did the testing. But sometimes school systems need that, or the advocate that the family has hired to kind of help get things moving, because often there's just so many students they're trying to provide services to that they don't always, not everyone gets exactly what is needed unless there's a little bit more of a push.
Right. So, and I've heard a number of stories where you do need to fight a little bit sometimes in order to get school districts to cooperate and be the squeaky wheel, so to speak.
It's nice when that it doesn't need to happen, but sometimes it does. And, you don't want to waste a couple of years getting this going. There's not that much time. Once they're in high school, if this still hasn't been figured out before then, there's not a lot of time to waste. So it is important to get it rolling. And if the school system is not cooperative, then to get some outside help.
Okay. So let's take it to the next step now. So somehow you've come to a diagnosis, and now the high school is cooperating and things are going well in high school. And now you're thinking about, the next step is going to be college. And knowing that we have some sort of learning disability, what do you have to do extra or different and when would you start and some of those kinds of things?
All right. Well, so first of all, one of the things that, I work with families on, I try to see families and the students as early as possible in high school. Oftentimes they don't show up to me until they're a junior. But occasionally I get to see kids, when they are sophomores, and ideally even as a freshman, just to make sure everybody's on the right track. But so the biggest thing first is to making sure that they're taking challenging courses in high school, and to not shy away from a challenging course if it's something the student can handle. That's the biggest thing that colleges are going to be looking for, disability or not, whether the student took the most challenging courses that they could handle. If they're able to take an honors course and even get an A in a non-honors course, they go ahead and challenge themselves.
I mean, I hear that question all the time, and some of the colleges around here, the common question is, should I take a AP course and get a B, or take an honors course and get the A, or a regular course and get the A? And depending on the college, but a lot of colleges, their answer is, well, just get an A in the AP course and don't sell yourself short. So I think that applies to anybody and everybody, that you want to, take the most challenging curriculum you can handle and do well at it.
Exactly. And that may mean that they're going to need to have some support, whether it's a regular tutor or whether it's the support they might get through their special ed services at school, the resource room, and to use whatever supports they need to get through. But, sometimes it just doesn't make any sense to push the child to a higher level course if they're just struggling in the basic college prep course. But, making sure that they are taking college prep courses if there is a plan for them to go to college. Sometimes kids will get to their senior year and their state doesn't mandate that they take 4 years of math. They say, I'm done with that, or I can just take sort of some fun electives. I've already taken, the minimum that I have to. Well, that's not going to help them get into, have as many choices when they are looking at colleges. So in general, having a rigorous curriculum all the way through with what support is needed. But many times students are just struggling to get through kind of the basics. So, helping them figure out while they're in high school, what are their strengths? What kind of learner are they? They should really be, paying attention to all of this, beginning to explore their interests, outside of school, making sure they're, doing some, whether it's in the summers, they either get a part-time job, they're volunteering, working at a camp or going to camp, they're doing something to increase their independence, to help them learn what they like and they don't like. High school is a time for lots of exploration and helping students become more independent. They're also going to need to learn these students how to advocate for themselves, so that they're going to need to learn about what their concerns are academically, what they're good at, and then learn how to ask for help and be perfectly comfortable with that. Because that in college is one of the biggest things, is that students are going to need to be willing to use the support that's there, and then they're going to need to ask for help, and it doesn't need to be a big deal. And in college, there is not sort of, you mentioned, like, potential stigma for students receiving special education services. There's really not in college. Everyone, lots of kids use tutoring and all kinds of services, and everyone's just doing their own thing and not really concerned about what anyone else is doing. So I really work with the students, my students right from the beginning, how they will need support in college, and it's important that they just accept that and realize it's not a big deal, and know right from the beginning that that's going to be part of the way that they're successful in college. And then I usually do go into talking with students just so I get their attention about graduation rates from college. This is from a government website, the nces.ed.gov. But, it varies from year to year. But as far as national statistics for kids graduating from college, ever from when they started, it's, in the 55% range or so. So as far as how many years it takes them to graduate, it's like, well, not a lot of kids are graduating in 4 anymore, and they're taking longer than that. But some kids just don't ever graduate. And for students who have learning disabilities, they say it's about 37% of kids who graduate from college. So, I talk to kids about you don't want to be one of those statistics. You need to make this work. And using the support in college is how that's going to help.
Right. And I want to rewind to something you said very early in this last answer. You mentioned something about, I really like to see students as a freshman or sophomore, but often I don't see them till junior or senior. And I would say the same thing on the financial side of things, but is your opinion, it sounds like, that earlier is better?
Oh, definitely. Just at least to check in again, to make sure they're taking the right things they're taking in college, and they start using their time wisely. As I said, if I don't see them till junior spring or the summer after their junior year, there's not a lot of time, first of all, to change what courses they've taken and how well they've done in school, and sort of get them to see the big picture that, it does matter. Your grades freshman and sophomore year do matter, because once your GPA is, your grade point average is at a certain low point, it takes a while to bring it back up. And a lot of kids just don't think those first couple of years matter. And also teaching them how to look for support. If you are in trouble, don't wait. Get some tutoring, get some help, talk to the teacher, find out if this is the right level class for you. All of these things we can kind of catch early on. But then just getting them to be able to start using, as we talked about, looking into what else is out there that they can round out their life with, extracurricular activities. Not to say that kids need to just join all kinds of extracurricular activities and be, ultra busy. That not at all. But that they should be doing something in addition to school that they feel passionate about. Figure out what it is they feel passionate about, and then stay with that. Colleges would much rather see students who have, had 1 or 2 things that they stuck with, whether it be a job, a volunteer activity, drama, a sport, whatever it is, than see the kid who junior spring all of a sudden realizes, oh my God, I have to pad my resume, and starts adding, all kinds of clubs and everything. That happens, and, that's bad. But really it's best if students can find something they're truly interested in and stick with it over the long term. So yes, starting early is good. And another thing that has to happen is that the whole idea of testing, the college entrance exams, SATs or the ACT, students who have children whose, testing is not their easiest thing to do, then they need to start thinking about this a little bit early. And if they receive accommodations for, let's say, extra time or any other type of accommodation for their regular testing at school, then they should be able to apply to have that sort of extra time or testing in a quiet room or whatever their accommodation is. They should be able to apply through their guidance counselor to the testing organization to get that in place, even for their PSAT, which would be in fall of junior year usually, which is a practice test for the SAT. Or some schools offer the plan, which is the precursor to the ACT, and that is often offered in the fall of sophomore year. So that really takes some planning ahead to, know that you're going to need that extra time, and months before work with the guidance counselor. Really it would be before school ends freshman year to try to get in that request to the guidance counselor to put in paperwork to apply for those accommodations. So they'll have the extra time on that practice testing. And then, what I often recommend is that students take a practice test of each, the ACT and the SAT. And then, when they get the results back, and hopefully if they have accommodations of extra time, let's say, hopefully they've had it on both so that you're comparing apples to apples. And then once they get those results back, hopefully can just pick one of those to focus on. There's so many things that go into this whole college preparation that it's a lot to focus on both tests. And so if they can just focus on one, that really makes life a lot easier.
Right. I did an interview with a test prep expert a couple of shows ago, and he essentially said that 25% of the population will do better on the ACT, 25% will do better on the SAT, and then about 50% will do about the same on either type of test. So and then for them, it doesn't matter. But if you happen to be a type of student that will do better on one than the other, if you spend the time to figure that out, it might help you out because of the style of the test. The way I understand it is different, and therefore you might excel at one test versus the other.
Exactly. And then just for students to know, I really think that in most cases, students do need to go ahead and take the test so they have more options. But they should know, and their parents should know that, in the long run, if it just turns out that the scores are not something that, they're going to be close to the average of the schools that they want to apply to, there are some schools, a good number of schools actually, like over 800, that are now test optional, which means that the student can send the scores if they're happy with them to apply to that school, or they don't have to send them if they don't want to. And there is a website for that families can look at. It's called fairtest.org. And then you look for the university listing, and it'll list all the schools that are test optional. And then, in some states, for instance, in Massachusetts, where I am, there's some state schools that if you have a documented learning disability, you can check off that you'd like your, test scores to be waived, and they don't have to use them in the entrance exam. So, people can check in their own states as to whether that's a possibility. But either way, they kind of need to take the testing just in case they want to apply to schools that do require it.
Okay. Now, let's say we're there now. We've decided we've got our testing figured out, and it's time to really start focusing on majors and schools and some of that kind of stuff. If you add in learning disabilities, what might you do extra or in addition on things like college visits and major selection and that kind of stuff?
Well, so the major selection is somewhat the same as really just, again, trying to encourage students to get out and try things. I've had students who say they wanted to be a nurse, and I really said, you've got to get out there and put yourself in a position where you've done some shadowing. You might be able to get some sort of internship or volunteer experience where you're at least going to be in settings so you see what that is like. Because for something like nursing, you have to apply into that usually as a freshman. So you really want to make sure that you've checked it out. Or even education, you often apply into that as a freshman. I had a student who really said she wanted to be a teacher. And so, I really talked with she and her family about let's make that into a summer job, get a job in a preschool. And then she worked there during the year. In the summer, it was more of a daycare and a preschool during the year. And, and it did, in fact, decide, yes, she did love working with kids. But that's an important thing to figure out before you go applying directly into a major. So, again, this is why it's helpful to work with families early in high school so that you can get these things rolling. So definitely having people look into that, that's really the same whether you have any kind of learning disability or not, but that's something that should be looked into and explored, and talk to everyone who does some sort of job like this. Can the student go spend an afternoon with them, and then that may lead to something else of spending more time there. So exploring those things, definitely. And then as far as looking into other things, the support, of course, is going to be very important. So if your student is getting support in high school, there's no question that they will need support in college. There's students who don't get any extra support in high school who will find that they need support in college. It's really just such a difference. The time management piece is huge, and a lot of students who have a learning disability, who have ADHD, or many are on the spectrum. Many of them, have difficulty handling time management and planning and breaking down big projects into smaller projects and to getting started, and they tend to procrastinate and whatnot. So, if you can think about in college, you usually get a syllabus for the whole semester, and it doesn't necessarily break down and say, okay, you need to do this tonight and this next week, and students have to figure that out themselves. They also may be in class for, an hour or two a day, or some days no classes at all. And they're, of course, expected to be studying and writing papers and in the library. And many students have not adjusted to have that discipline and figure out how to do that. So there's really a lot that is different in college, and kids will need support and help with that who've needed support in high school. I mean, you think about how structured high school is with their classes, and then they've gotten support, and then they have their families, and people are telling them to do their homework, and people are waking them up to go to school. course, none of that happens in college. So again, families should also be working on just helping with the independence piece, expecting their kids to set their alarms and get up by themselves, not rescuing them when they forget their lunch or something else at home, allowing them to have some minor failures and consequences in high school so that they become more resilient and have to figure out these things on their own, so that when they go off to college, they're a bit more ready.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about visits then. If, again, I'm looking at 7 or 8 or 10 or 20 colleges to start, is there a difference in the amount of support they may provide? And how do you gauge how much support they will provide? And is there a department that you would talk to, or how do you do that?
Certainly students know they're going to need support. Let me talk about the different types of support in colleges. So there's 3 different levels. First of all, if your student has documentation, and what I mean by that is the testing. It's not necessarily their individualized education plan, their IEP plan that they have in high school that talks about what services they got in high school. Some schools may want to see that, but not all. And that's not what gets you that's not what colleges need to be able to give you services. What they need is testing. So either the psychological educational testing that you've had through your school system, or that neuropsych testing that I spoke about that sometimes people go to privately. That testing, which talks about some sort of diagnosis and why you need services, that's the testing, the documentation that needs to go to schools, that needs to go to colleges. It does not go to the admissions department. It goes to the Disabilities Service Office, or whatever the school calls that office, but traditionally that's the name of that office. And they are the people that by law need to provide accommodations if the student has this documentation. And they also, in general, that testing needs to be current within 3 years. So if a student had their testing done in 8th grade, they're going to want to get their testing again before they go to college if they are looking to receive accommodations in college. So that needs to be current. So there are 3 levels of support. The first level is called accommodations. And that is where, again, they're federally mandated to give someone, let's say, basically colleges just need to level the playing field. So they're just providing equal access for all students. So if the student needs extra time because of their documented disability, or they need, quiet testing room, or they need preferential seating, or they need help with note taking, those type of things, or, they may be hard of hearing or something more of a medical issue. All of those type of things will be covered under accommodations. And that's all the colleges are required by federal law to provide. Some colleges go more than that. So that's the first level. Then there's another level that's generally referred to as services. And then in this situation, it may be that the student can meet with someone, probably like somebody who is more of a learning specialist, and they may be able to meet with them some number of times to get help with things that I discussed earlier, like time management and helping prioritize their schedule and break down their syllabus into manageable pieces, that type of thing. So that level can be called services. And then the third level is a comprehensive program. And that often has additional fees. There are some programs in the country that have comprehensive programs without fees, and that's a great thing. If you can, and often they also have a separate application to get into these comprehensive programs. So, it's for kids who really need the services, they will be able to meet with a learning specialist or some sort of special education person 1 or more times a week, often the same person that they can go back to, and they'll be helping them regularly, and it's a definite program, and they often interact with professors on the student's behalf, and they may be priority registration so that they can get, register before all the classes are gone that are going to be the more appropriate classes for them. So it's a real comprehensive program. Many times those can be, a few $1,000s per semester for that type of service. But for kids who really need it, it's going to be worth it to help them stay in school. And I should just add one other thing is that there are times when a school might really feel just right for the student in lots of other ways and have a particular major they want and be how far away from home they want and the finances are right and everything else is a good fit, but it doesn't seem like there's going to be quite enough support as far as, academic support. It is possible for the family to then look into hiring an academic coach, in addition to, let's say, the extra time the student gets on tests or their accommodations. If they're not able to meet with someone regularly there, the family could hire an academic coach either by Skype or someone local to meet with that student. And, they're going to end up paying fees at some of these schools anyway, so they could pay the fees to a coach. So there are ways to go about it if the school doesn't necessarily have all you need. But it is important to make sure it can be set up.
How would I find a coach that you just mentioned?
There are some organizations. I think if you just Google executive function coach or ADHD coach, the EDGE Foundation, I know, has some coaches for ADHD. I think that there are places, and I'm sure if you Google it, you could find them. Also in each area, even asking the colleges often know, the Disability Services Office will often know local people that would work. So, having these different, and then of course at every school there's tutoring, and there's often a writing center, and there's often a math center. And so what I talk to students about is that you're going to need to use all that you can get through your, documented disability and through the Disability Services Office, use everything that they will offer you, and go use everything else that all the kids in the school can use, the tutoring and the math centers and writing centers. Use them both. Strategic about setting up your schedule so you have time to go get all this support. And often when you put it all together, it's enough. The biggest problem is really getting kids to, well, first of all, they do it to be in a place where the atmosphere is right, where it's going to be challenging for them, but where they're not just, barely staying alive every day academically. It needs to be a good fit for that. And everything else, of course, socially and financially has to be a good fit. But then, they have to be willing to use the supports that are there. They have to be willing to go use the tutoring. A number of schools will have workshops on time management, on writing an essay, on adjusting to college in many different ways. Kids have to be willing to go, and I think it's really important to talk about that stuff, because oftentimes kids don't. They're like, oh, embarrassed, so why would I go do that? It's more, I try to talk to kids, it's more embarrassing and significantly depressing to have to you're flunk out of school by Thanksgiving and you're home on your parents' couch. It's not embarrassing to go to these things and get help. Everybody does. It's not a big deal in college. It's a whole new ball game. Everybody's struggling. And also to surround themselves with kids who are there to get an education, not with kids who seem to just be there to have a great time and, school's an afterthought. Because there are plenty of school kids who are doing that in college, and these kids can't afford to hang out with that crowd. It's just not going to, be helpful to them in any way. So, we discuss all of this and really try to get the student to be on board with, you need to be ready to use all this. And if they're not ready to do all that, maybe they're not quite ready to go to college right away. For some kids, it may make sense for them to take a year and do something else and mature and work or do an internship or whatever it is, if they're not ready to do what they need to do to succeed in college.
Right, that makes sense. So if I'm in the process of visiting, is it appropriate for me to be asking these questions when I've got a junior or senior and I'm visiting and asking where these centers are and talking to people that can help us with that?
Definitely. I mean, I don't think that the student on the tour wants his mom or dad saying, "Where's the Disability Service Office?" On the tour with the college tour guide. But I think that's something that oftentimes is best looked into before you go. So look up Disability Service, see if you can make an appointment with them, and see what their services are, what they offer, and what they can't provide. People are usually pretty honest about this is what we can offer, and we only have, let's say, 2 learning specialists for 1,000 students. Well, then oh gee, how hard is it to get an appointment? And the first week of school, it's going to take 3 weeks to even talk to somebody. That's not going to be enough for many students. So, and that's just the reality at some places. So, it is good to find out what it is. But I don't think those questions have to be asked in the middle of a tour, because that will make the high school student feel uncomfortable. But definitely, and so if the school is really far away and you're not going to get back to it, then that can all be done in one visit. Or if it's, it doesn't necessarily have to be done on the first visit if the student is just warming up to this idea. Right. Many times the high school students are a little bit wary about all of this, and they usually, once they've gotten a little bit older and realize that they just need to do it, then it's no big deal. So you don't necessarily, as a parent, you have to gauge your child and see whether I want to start off with all this, or let's just sort of whet their appetite with what would be a good college in general, and then continue to look into the support as you go. But the student should certainly know right from the beginning that the support is going to be a piece of the decision. that they're going to need to be somewhere where the support is right. And in general, where the academics are, again, challenging, but where they're not just struggling just to stay afloat.
All right, let's talk a little bit about the financial side of things. I'm assuming that everything is the same as far as financial aid and need-based aid and merit aid. But what else, as far as finances, might help for families?
Well, so yes, I think you're certainly right that everything else, financial aid, is basically the same. I think the only thing that student families can be aware of is that there are some scholarships that are specific to a student's learning disability. So I mentioned like the EDGE Foundation before. They have some scholarships for ADHD in particular. Even if families Google college scholarship, learning disabilities, a number of organizations will come up. Those tend to be national organizations, and it certainly can be worth a try depending on the student's motivation. In general, I find that the national scholarships are certainly hard to get because there's so many students applying for them. And then if they can find anything locally as far as scholarships, that tends to be an easier thing to, be successful at getting one. Many times the school's special education, the parent group oftentimes will sponsor a scholarship at high school. So, they can look into that if there's any kind of local scholarship. And then also, let's say if your student has Asperger's, let's say, like for instance, the Asperger's Association of New England, your regional organization for that type of disability may have scholarships. So, or if they happen to have, whatever it is that's going on, they may look into that. But it certainly is going to be always helpful. They tend to, be able to pay for books or something. It's not going to be a major event in most cases. Certainly if the student can get merit aid, that, as you know, can be a much more lucrative thing. And of course, your folks get all the information from you about all the aid in general. The only other thing is, I guess, on money is just that they do need to be aware that if they have to pay for comprehensive services, that's another additional anywhere from $3,000 to $7,000 a year. Oftentimes, students need more of that in their first year, and then maybe able to scale back a bit by their second year, and then even more so as they get older. But some students will need, services through the whole thing. But certainly, paying for support is a lot less expensive than the student flunking out and then trying to start again somewhere else, or not going back at all, and then they've also paid for a semester of college and have nothing to show for it. Support is important, even though it is, I'm sure, frustrating for people to pay additionally for it. And I have heard that there are some schools where it has worked for the students' comprehensive fees for, the learning support program. I have heard in cases where they've been able to have that as part of their financial aid package, like, considered as one of the, it goes into sort of the sticker price for the school and it includes that, but at other places it has not worked that way. So that's, it just has to be figured out at each school.
So let's wrap things up here a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about your business, though. You obviously have a website, and it's www.rightfitcoaching.com. So tell me a little bit about the types of families that you help and why they might look you up and some of those things.
Okay, sure. I work with kids who are in high school who think they want to go to college and whose families would like them to go to college. But for many of the kids, is a question, is it going to work out? And is this the right thing for them? And should they go to college right after high school? So, most of these students I work with, we are looking towards college and exploring colleges, and we'll go ahead and, they will apply to some colleges. And then occasionally a student, as it gets to be the spring of their senior year, everyone, including the students, decide, they're really not quite ready. And so that they go ahead and accept at whatever college is most appropriate for them, and then ask to defer for a year. And then make a plan, as we talked about, whether it be internship or work or travel or volunteer or something. And then they're able to come back in a year, and as long as they haven't changed their mind about anything, are able to get right back into the queue and go back to that school the following year. So that's, how to go about it if you do have someone who's thinking about what's, tends to be called a gap year, is to go ahead and go through the whole college process, get accepted, pick your school, and then ask them to defer for a year. And really, colleges all are fine with that these days. They're, happy to have someone go off and become more mature and more ready to come back and be successful on their campus.
And then you coach people, essentially. So if they have a freshman and they want to get started early, or if they've got a senior and they're scrambling,
Yeah, everything, both of those and in between, right? So, again, I don't see too many freshmen, but I'm happy when I do, and we just have that initial meeting and make sure we're all on the same page. And then I do have, some sophomores. I'd say the majority of kids who come to me are juniors, but sophomores would be great. I think, they just have more time for their students to integrate all the things that we're talking about. They can do it over time. It's not a big rush. All these things like becoming more independent and exploring what you're good at and learning how to advocate for yourself, they're not things that happen overnight. So the more time we have with that is great. So we work on all that type of stuff. And so people will come to me, and then we'll, start focusing on all those type of things when they're a sophomore, and then into their junior fall, we kind of start working on the whole testing plan, what's going to happen with that. Recommending some test prep. Most students do need and do some sort of test prep for the SAT or the ACT. And then we're working, starting to zero in on what's going to look good for colleges. So I have, campus visit forms that I talk to students about using to take notes when they go on their campus visits. And, in the beginning, it's just more of a window shopping. So they get a feel for big school, small school, city school, rural, what am I looking for? And then, of course, I bring in all the other things we've talked about, the support and all that. And we figure out what are they interested in particular majors, are they completely up in the air, all of that. And then by their junior early winter, we have back usually their PSAT score and their first, semester or their first fall grades of their junior year. And then we're able to, by that early winter, I make up a college list of schools for them to be exploring. And then we take it from there as far as narrowing those down, and hopefully junior spring they're doing a lot of visiting schools, and then we keep updating from their feedback as they go out to visit schools. And then that summer I'm usually working with students on their essays in July, their main essays, and in August the common application becomes live for that following year. And so in August I'm having the students really work a lot on their common application, which, many allows you to apply to many schools at once. And so that by come fall of senior year, they hopefully have a definite list, and they may be doing some revisiting of schools. And they're also maybe going back for interviews, which we of course do interview prep and whatnot. And their senior fall is busy for, they need to still do well in school their senior fall and be taking challenging courses. Schools will look as to what courses they're taking senior year and their grades. So it is not a time to take their foot off the gas, and they have to keep going with that. And then, of course, they're usually involved in some sort of extracurricular activities or a job, and it's busy. So as much as we can get done in the summer, that's really a big push to get a lot of the stuff done in the summer so that come the fall, they're, of course, still finishing up.
And it's your job to kind of hold their hand and be available for questions and coach them on what they should be doing throughout this whole process?
Well, definitely. And this way it allows the families, too, not to have to kind of nag their student every time they see them. Did you write that essay? Did you fill out that? That's my job. And when it's a more professional relationship back and forth with the student, it's easier than if it's your parent. For students who live close to me, we person in the beginning, but then oftentimes we go to Skype after that because they're busy and just trying to get their schedules and when they can come and drive the traffic and get to the office. So oftentimes we do a lot by Skype. Or, they'll be sending me their essay and we're both have it up on the computer looking at it, and we're talking by Skype as we are now, or, their common application, they can give me their password, we can look at it together. So all of this I work on with them so their parent doesn't have to be right in the middle of it.
Right. Now, I would assume that some of your meetings are with the parents as well, though, and kind of keeping them in the loop and giving them some information and coaching? Of
course. So definitely, the beginning meeting when we all meet together, and then I split up, and I have already had the parents answer a questionnaire, and then I separate parents and student, and I meet with the parents separately for 45 minutes or an hour, and then I'll be able to interview the students separately. And so, I make sure that I know exactly where they're coming from and what their concerns are and what their hopes are for their child. And, I, of course, have read all the background material. My students always have a lot of paperwork. They have their education plan from school. They have their testing, whether it was done in school or outside of school. I need progress reports and their transcript and, a graded writing essay. I need to really be able to understand where the student is so I know, where things will fit for them in college. So we're doing that together. And then most of my meetings after that are with the student, but then there's always either an email follow-up or if they come to the office, sometimes the parents will come in for the last 5 or 10 minutes and we, talk about what was what went on. So yeah, there's lots of email back and forth. Sometimes I'll just have phone conversations just with parents if there's stuff that they want to talk about separately. And then we always meet together as a group when I give them the college list and with lots of information about each school and why I chose it and the support level. We always meet together for that. And then, whenever else something has come up, we can get together as a family. And then I even get together with of course, once they apply to schools, so obviously I'm helping them all through the application process. They, of course, write their essay. I never put my pen or cursor to their paper, but I do give them lots of feedback on their essay, and there's lots of going back and doing additional drafts, but it needs to be their own voice and their own writing. And so we'll work through all the applications. They'll get their choices, and then we get back together usually to talk about the different choices and what are the pros and cons, and, going back for second visits and taking some classes and sitting in on class and whatnot. So there's a process of what makes the most sense once they get their offers. And then even when they have decided on a school, I meet with them again in the summer to make sure that they're all set up for their services before they get to campus that fall.
Okay.
If they have registered with the Disabilities Service Office, they're all set to go. They're planning on attending orientation. And sometimes students even need to take let's call it sort of a college readiness courses over the summer before college, for kids who are just going to need a little extra help with their writing or math or reading. And there are many programs that will offer that the summer before college. So, oftentimes I'm helping families decide whether they need something like that. So, and then I'm still just in touch, at least by email, with parents and with students that fall of their freshman year. How's it going? Are you using the services? Everything okay? Just as a check-in to make sure that the student is using the services at school and is doing okay.
Great. So I know you have a website, and I know there's some free resources there. Can you explain a couple of things that people can get by going to your website?
Sure. So on the website, there is a page that says resources, and there's a few things there. One is just general college resources, and there's lots of helpful information on things like test prep and, just the general college stuff. There's also another page that's for students with learning differences, and that will be, information on various learning disabilities, ADHD, kids who are on the autism spectrum. There's a lot of resources there, so that's helpful. There's also a book resource page with lots of college books, but most of them will have something helpful in it for kids, specific to kids who have some learning differences. So those are all helpful. And the other thing I'd point parents towards is to let you know that I do have a complimentary electronic newsletter that I send out monthly. And so I invite people to sign up for that. They can just look for I think it's the bottom right of my home page. It'll say newsletters. And you can sign up there, and then all the previous posts are archived. So on a rainy day, you're looking for something to do, you can go, look through lots of college articles and get a lot of information there.
Great. Well, I appreciate you spending time with me today and giving me all this information and giving our listeners all this information. Hopefully people will hit your website, send you emails, and get in touch with you get your help and so forth. But we'll wrap things up here, and we're going to move on next to the Brad Recommends segment.
Okay, Brad, nice to speak with you. Thanks very much for having me.
Yep, thank you.
The latest tips, tricks, and tools you can use today. This is Brad Recommends on Taming the High Cost of College.
Today I'm going to recommend a book called Been There, Should Have Done That, 995 Tips for Making the Most of College. This is a great book, I think, for any graduating senior that's going off to college, or even freshmen or sophomore that are already in college could glean a lot from this, especially if they're struggling in various areas. But this is a quick read. There's 995 tips, and the book itself is 280 pages, so there's a number of tips on each page, and it's just a quick paragraph about very basic recommendations. Things like, if you have a choice between two professors for the same class, it's worth checking them out. Or there's a section where the top 10 ways to make your roommate happy. One of the recommendations there is, remember, it's a dorm room, not a romantic hideaway. Talking about the girlfriend-boyfriend in the room issue. So there's all kinds of just really quick things to read that kind of spark your imagination on, there's a topic I should think about, or, there's an idea I could pursue that might make things work out for me. And it covers all areas, from academics to social to college settings and partying and all the different things that most college freshmen are dealing with. So I recommend this book, and I also recommend, I guess, these types of books in general. This isn't the only book that's designed for a freshman off to college. There's many more, and a lot of them are very highly rated. So if it's not this book, pick one or two others, but have your student actually read some of this stuff. I think students could gain a lot of perspective in the summer before college if they spend some time reading one or two of these books and perhaps talking with their parents about it. So maybe you could have a few discussions about a book that you read together. But again, I think these books are great. Some of them are, quick reads. Some of them aren't. This particular one I have a copy of. I've looked through it. I think there's a lot of great snippets of great information. I think it also perhaps would need to be digested or reread, at Thanksgiving or Christmas break to circle back around and say, oh yeah, there's some things I could do as well. All right, that wraps things up. We are going to roll the credits now and finish up this last bit of this episode. We will have some episodes coming up on some great topics like tax planning. I'm hoping to get an interview on homeschooling, so there's lots of stuff coming up. I appreciate you taking the time to listen. If you think you're getting good information, I would love it if you went to iTunes and left us a review. And that's all for now. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening to the Taming the High Cost of College podcast. Now it's time for you to take action. Head to tamingthehighcostofcollege.com for show notes, bonus content, and to leave feedback for Brad. The next step on your college journey starts now.
Brad Baldridge is a registered representative of Cambridge Investment Research and an investment advisor representative of Cambridge Investment Research Advisors, a registered investment advisor. Securities are offered through Cambridge Investment Research Incorporated, a broker-dealer and member of FINRA and SIPC. Brad owns two companies, Baldridge Wealth Management and Baldridge College Solutions. The Baldridge companies are not affiliated with Cambridge Investment Research.